Hello, students. This is going to be a short lecture just because Gerald Ford kind of had a short presidency and so forth because his only term in office was finishing out Nixon's second term, and he ends up losing the election of 1976 against Jimmy Carter and so forth. So we're going to hit the highlights of his presidency. We're not going to go in great detail, and this will be pretty brief, but there's really kind of four big events that happened during his presidency. One is he is going to pardon Richard Nixon so that we don't have a president going to prison for obstruction of justice or perjury or something like that. Also, South Vietnam is going to fall to North Vietnam and officially ends the Vietnam War, and Vietnam is united under communism. Thirdly, he's going to be dealing with continuing stagflation economy. And then fourth, kind of his thing he's most known for is the Helsinki Accords that he signs in Helsinki, Finland, with many communist Eastern European countries and so forth. So really, when Nixon comes into office, he's the only not elected president in American history, because Spiro Agnew had been elected as Nixon's VP both in 1968 and 1972. But Spiro Agnew had to resign 10 days before the Saturday Night Massacre of the firing of Archibald Cox. And so Gerald Ford had been appointed as the vice president, but it had to be confirmed by Congress. And he was confirmed by Congress and so forth. But he was the Republican minority leader in the Senate. And what ends up happening is Gerald Ford comes into office. He appoints New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller as his vice president. And so neither one of these guys had ever been elected into office. And so Gerald Ford is the only one that has that unique title. But as soon as he comes into office, the administration is getting pounded with questions from journalists about Nixon. Is Nixon going to be tried? Is Nixon going to be convicted? Is he going to go to prison? Yada, yada, yada. Well, the economy was not great in the 1970s. I've established that in a previous lecture, but Ford is like, come on, we gotta move on with this, with the economy, and his plan of whip inflation now was trying to stop the spread of inflation, and he's not able to focus on the economy. And so finally, Ford is like, you know what, I'm going to pardon the president, and so he pardons him for any past wrongdoing or any other wrongdoing that may come to light in the future that he had done while his time in office, so that the country can move on. Now, at the time, it was very controversial. It appeared that, and of course, it's not the case. There's no evidence that this was the case, but it was appeared that Nixon had worked out a deal like, hey, if I appoint you as my VP, if I have to resign, will you pardon me? That's not actually what happened. Gerald Ford's a good, decent man, and there's not any evidence. Ford just did it so the nation could move on, and so forth. Today Ford is probably more praised for that. At the time, he was very much criticized, and so forth. Now, because of Nixon and the pardoning of him, a lot of Republicans get voted out of office in the 1974 midterm elections, and the Democrats are going to have pretty much control of Congress. So let's look at the economic problems that Ford is dealing with. So I've covered that he's dealing with people constantly asking about the Watergate scandal. But inflation is really out of control in the 70s. The unemployment were rising. And so our economy is stagnant, it's not growing, and we have massive inflation. So that's what we call stagflation. And so his whip inflation now plan, it just called for more direct action and so forth. Now, one of the things that Ford, as a congressman, had typically been against government spending and increased spending, but he's going to have to support increasing unemployment benefits and also a tax cut to try to help the economy. Now, because Ford is facing a Democrat-controlled Congress and as a Republican president, he is going to be forced to have the government take a more active role in the government. Now, one of the things is Ford is going to veto several government spending bills, but he ends up having his vetoes overridden quite a bit. And so Ford is not going to be seen as having a successful presidency. I think he kind of came at the wrong time. And so when South Vietnam, they get attacked again in 1973 and 74, The war gets renewed. Ford tries to send in more military aid to South Vietnam. It's just not enough. You can't stop the other problems of South Vietnam by no matter how many jeeps and tanks and so forth you send over there. And so the War Powers Act prevented him from resending in American troops because we had pulled out, and Congress was like, no, we're not going to send any more combat troops over there. And so what ends up happening is communists in Cambodia captured an American merchant ship called the Maya Guinness, and Ford was able to send Marines to recapture the ship because that's less than 60 days, and that's a really short kind of commando mission. But what's going to happen in 1975 when South Vietnam falls to communism, Ford is not going to be able to send in troops to try to save them. The United States Navy was off, not too far off the coast of South Vietnam, and it was thought that a lot of South Vietnamese thought that they were going to get rescued by the Americans and get evacuated. But because of the negative anti-war sentiment, nothing is done about it. And one of the things, though, that Ford does is continue the Dayton Agreement with Asia, particularly in China, and also with the Soviet Union, because in 1975, Ford travels to Helsinki, Finland. Okay, and basically what it does is it was supposed to, all these countries were signed its guaranteeing basic human rights. Now, the criticism of the Helsinki Accords is that NATO countries were already abiding by human rights protection, and the Eastern European countries were not, and like such as the Soviet Union and whatnot. Ford continues with the SALT agreements, trying to work out other arms reductions. Nothing really of any significance gets passed with that. Carter was going to sign another agreement later, but because of the invasion of Afghanistan, that's called off. But really, it's the INF Treaty with Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev in 1987 that becomes a big nuclear arms reduction deal. Also, Ford pushes for trying to establish better relations with African countries who had gained independence with decolonization efforts, starting in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and so forth. And so that was established, kind of creating embassies and so forth in these new countries. And so here's actually the United States signing the Helsinki Accords. And so it's trying to bring more cooperation. So this is kind of continuation of détente, which is good. Also in 1976, it was the year that my parents were married. It's the bicentennial celebration. So it's the 200th anniversary of our country's founding. But actually, it should have been a bigger celebration what it was, but because of Watergate and Vietnam and the economy, Americans are a little bit kind of down about it. There's still concerts and, air shows and so forth. Like I grew up going to Little Rock Air Force Base air shows and so forth and fireworks. And I've actually been, as a kid, I've actually been in D.C. on July 4th in the fireworks show there. It's really incredible and so forth. Now we'll get to the revival of feminism and then very important Supreme Court cases in the next lecture.